The battle after Ia Drang America rarely talks about. Most people who know the Battle of Ia Drang remember one place. Landing Zone X-ray. They remember American helicopters dropping into a small clearing beneath the Chupong Massif. They remember Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore. They remember 3 days of desperate fighting against North Vietnamese regulars. And if they have seen the movie We Were Soldiers, they may remember X-ray as the place where the battle ended. But it did not end there. On the morning of November 17, 1965, another American battalion walked away from X-ray. Their destination was a clearing a few miles away called Landing Zone Albany. Many of those soldiers believed the worst was behind them. Instead, they were about to enter one of the deadliest American engagements of the entire Vietnam War. More than 150 Americans would be killed. More than 120 would be wounded. And a battalion that had started the morning marching through the central Highlands would end the day broken into isolated groups fighting simply to survive. This is the other half of Ia Drang, the battle that Hollywood largely left out, and the battle that revealed a terrifying weakness in America's new way of fighting in Vietnam. Technically, Albany was not the battle after Ia Drang. It was the final major engagement of Ia Drang itself. But to understand why it happened, we first have to return to the morning after X-ray, November 17, 1965. For 3 days, the Ia Drang Valley had been filled with artillery, aircraft, helicopters, and infantry combat. At Landing Zone X-ray, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had fought North Vietnamese regulars at extremely close range. The Americans had held the landing zone. They had inflicted severe losses, and the new 1st Cavalry Division had demonstrated something the Army desperately wanted to prove. Helicopters could move American infantry deep into hostile territory. Artillery could support them from distant fire bases. Aircraft could strike enemy concentrations, and wounded soldiers could be evacuated while ammunition and reinforcements were flown in. X-ray seemed to validate the concept of air mobility. But nearby, the North Vietnamese were learning too. They had seen what American artillery and aircraft could do when U.S. soldiers had enough distance between themselves and the enemy. The obvious answer was to remove that distance. Get close. Stay close. Fight so near the Americans that their greatest weapons became difficult to use. At Albany, that lesson would be applied with devastating effect. Early on November 17th, the American units still around X-ray were ordered to move. B-52 bombers were scheduled to strike the Chupong area. The troops on the ground had to clear the danger zone. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, headed toward Landing Zone Columbus. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, would move toward Landing Zone Albany. It was only a few miles, but this would not be a helicopter flight. They would walk. McDade's force included most of his 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, along with Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry. The men were tired. Some had already been involved in the fighting around X-ray. Many had gone through long periods with little sleep, and now they were moving through the heat and vegetation of the central Highlands. At first, nothing happened. The column moved through tall elephant grass and patches of jungle. The reconnaissance platoon led the way. Behind it came Alpha Company, then Delta Company, then Charlie Company. Battalion headquarters followed farther back. Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, brought up the rear. As the march continued, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, separated from McDade's force and continued toward Columbus. McDade's men turned toward Albany. Now they were on their own. There were warning signs. The reconnaissance troops noticed indications that North Vietnamese soldiers had recently moved through the area. Then, near Albany, something more important happened. 2 North Vietnamese soldiers were captured. The time was close to noon. The Americans were now only a short distance from the Albany clearing. McDade ordered the column to halt. He moved forward to question the prisoners. Then he called his company commanders toward the head of the column for a meeting. That decision would have enormous consequences. The American formation was no longer moving. It was stretched across hundreds of yards. Companies and platoons were separated by vegetation. Many soldiers simply stopped where they were. Some rested, some ate, some tried to sleep, and several company commanders were now away from the men they were supposed to command. Even more dangerous, some of their radio operators had gone forward with them. The battalion had not formed a defensive perimeter. It had not reached a secure landing zone. It was simply a long column of tired soldiers sitting in elephant grass, and very close to them were North Vietnamese troops. The Americans had not discovered a few isolated enemy scouts. They had walked into an area occupied by major PAVN forces. Elements of the 1st Battalion, 33rd Regiment were nearby. So was the 8th Battalion of the 66th Regiment. The 33rd had already suffered during the fighting in the campaign. But the 8th Battalion of the 66th was comparatively fresh. The situation was almost the reverse of X-Ray. At X-Ray, American troops had established a perimeter and then fought to hold it while artillery and aircraft struck around them. At Albany, the Americans were caught while moving. They were spread out. Their command structure had been disrupted at exactly the wrong moment, and their enemy was close enough to attack almost directly into the formation. At approximately 1:20 in the afternoon, the battle exploded. Mortar rounds and small arms fire struck around the American troops. Then North Vietnamese infantry came out of the vegetation. They did not remain at long range. They pushed directly into the American column. Within minutes, what had been one battalion became a series of separate fights. Platoons lost contact with companies. Companies lost contact with battalion headquarters. Men sometimes could not see farther than a few yards through the grass and trees. There was no single clean front line. The enemy was in front of them, beside them, and in some places behind them. This was exactly the kind of battlefield the North Vietnamese wanted. American artillery and air power were still available, but using those weapons became far more dangerous when soldiers from both sides were mixed together. At X-Ray, artillery could create a wall of fire around an American perimeter. At Albany, there was no clear perimeter to protect. The battle had become too close, too confused, and too fragmented. Near the head of the column, Alpha Company of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry was hit hard. Farther back, Charlie Company suffered catastrophic losses. Other groups of Americans fought from small patches of ground wherever they could find cover. Some officers and non-commissioned officers managed to gather scattered soldiers and build small defensive positions. Others found themselves cut off completely. Captain George Forrest had been called forward from Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry. When the firing began, he immediately tried to return to his men. His company was at the rear of the formation. Forrest made his way back through the chaos and began organizing a defensive position. That decision helped prevent the rear of the column from collapsing completely. But elsewhere, the situation was becoming worse. The first minutes of an ambush are often decisive. At Albany, the North Vietnamese had surprise. They had position, and most importantly, they had destroyed the Americans' ability to fight as one coordinated battalion. The battle became a collection of individual struggles. Small groups fired into tree lines. Machine gun teams tried to establish fields of fire. Wounded men remained trapped between positions. Radio operators attempted to reconnect units that no longer knew exactly where the others were. And officers tried to determine where friendly troops ended and enemy troops began. The North Vietnamese continued pressing close. This was not accidental. Their commanders understood the advantage. If they stayed close enough to American troops, calling artillery or airstrikes risked hitting Americans as well. Years later, North Vietnamese commander Nguyen Hu An described the concept in simple terms. His men needed to move inside the American formation and fight at extremely close range. The tactic would later become associated with the idea of grabbing the Americans by the belt. At Albany, the principle worked. But American firepower did not disappear entirely. As the battle continued, aircraft reached the area. A-1 Sky Raiders attacked positions around the fragmented American force. Bombs and napalm were used where controllers believed they could do so without destroying friendly positions. Artillery also continued to play a role. Gradually, the pressure around some American groups began to ease. But there was no dramatic reversal. There was no single counterattack that suddenly restored the battalion. Albany remained a desperate fight, and daylight was disappearing. This created another problem. The battlefield was covered with wounded men. Some were with organized American groups, others were alone. Some small pockets did not know whether rescue would reach them before the North Vietnamese did. As darkness fell, the Americans attempted to consolidate. Reinforcements and medical support began reaching the area. Nearby American units moved to help secure positions and create routes for evacuation. Helicopters attempted to bring in supplies and remove casualties whenever conditions allowed, but the fighting continued into the night. For many survivors, darkness did not mean relief. It meant listening, waiting, and trying to determine whether the movement nearby came from another American or from the enemy. The North Vietnamese had also taken serious casualties. Their soldiers had spent hours attacking American positions at extremely close range while U.S. aircraft and artillery struck around the battlefield. By the early hours of November 18th, the intensity of the fighting finally began to decline. At dawn, the Americans fired into suspected enemy positions. There was little response. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn. Only then could the scale of what had happened become clear. The official numbers vary slightly depending on which army record is used. Contemporary reports listed 151 Americans killed, 121 wounded, and several missing. Later army histories and commemorations commonly place the American death toll at 155. Either way, the meaning is the same. In a matter of hours, more than 150 American soldiers had been killed near Landing Zone Albany. More than 120 others were wounded. Some individual companies had been devastated. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry suffered especially severe losses. The North Vietnamese also suffered heavily. The 1st Cavalry Division's after-action report claimed more than 400 enemy bodies counted and additional casualties estimated. But body counts from Vietnam were battlefield estimates and should not be treated as perfectly precise measurements. Both sides walked away from Ia Drang believing they had learned something important. The United States looked at X-ray and saw proof that air mobility worked. A battalion could be inserted into remote terrain, surrounded by a larger enemy force, and survive through discipline, helicopters, artillery, and air power. That lesson encouraged more operations designed to find enemy forces and bring superior American firepower against them. But the North Vietnamese looked at the same campaign and saw a different lesson. American helicopters could move quickly. American aircraft were devastating. American artillery could destroy exposed formations. But those advantages became much less powerful when North Vietnamese troops got extremely close. Albany demonstrated that an American battalion moving through difficult terrain could still be vulnerable, if it could be surprised, if its command structure could be disrupted, and if the fighting became so close that supporting fire was difficult to use. In that sense, X-ray and Albany cannot really be understood separately. They were two halves of the same warning. X-ray showed what the American system could do when it worked. Albany showed what could happen when that system was denied the conditions it needed. And there was another lesson. Exhaustion mattered. Security mattered. Reconnaissance mattered. Command and control mattered. A battalion that had helicopters, artillery, and aircraft somewhere nearby was still a battalion of men on the ground. If those men were caught in the wrong formation at the wrong moment, technology could not instantly rescue them. Army officers would study Albany for decades. The decision to halt the column, the decision to call commanders forward, the lack of a strong defensive formation, the limited knowledge of enemy positions, the difficulty of controlling hundreds of men once the shooting began, all became subjects for professional military analysis. But outside military history circles, Albany never became as famous as X-ray. One reason is simple. Popular culture remembered X-ray, the book We Were Soldiers Once. And Young told the stories of both X-ray and Albany. But when director Randall Wallace adapted that story for the 2002 film We Were Soldiers, he chose to focus on X-ray. Albany was left out. That decision made sense for a movie centered on Hal Moore and his battalion. But it also meant that millions of people came away knowing only the first half of the Ia Drang story. The real battle did not end with the defenders of X-ray walking away. The next morning, another American battalion was still in the valley, and North Vietnamese soldiers were still waiting. There is a reason Albany deserves to be remembered. Not because it proves that one army was brave and another was not, Soldiers on both sides fought with extraordinary determination, and both sides paid heavily. Albany matters because it revealed the nature of the war that was coming. The United States possessed helicopters, jet aircraft, artillery, and enormous industrial power. North Vietnam could not match those advantages directly, so its commanders looked for ways to make those advantages less important. Close the distance, choose the terrain, break large American units into smaller groups, accept enormous losses if necessary, then disappear before American firepower could fully destroy the force. The United States, meanwhile, would continue searching for enemy formations and attempting to destroy them through mobility and firepower. Those competing approaches would shape much of the fighting that followed. And in November 1965, both were already visible in one small valley in the central Highlands. At X-Ray, America saw the promise of its new way of war. At Albany, it saw the danger. The two landing zones were only a few miles apart. The battles happened only days apart. Yet their stories could hardly feel more different. One became legendary. The other became a warning. And for the soldiers who walked toward Landing Zone Albany on November 17, 1965, that warning came at a terrible price. Ia Drang was America's first major clash with North Vietnamese regulars. But the most important lesson may not have come from the famous landing zone. It may have come from the long column of exhausted soldiers in the elephant grass. Because at Albany, the United States discovered something it would face again and again in Vietnam. Having overwhelming firepower was not the same as always being able to use it. And sometimes, the most dangerous moment came just when soldiers believed the battle was already over.